They said I'd never amount to anything after I walked away from the family law firm. Said I threw away a Harvard law degree for some government paperwork job that barely paid the bills. My mother stopped introducing me at country club events. My father removed my nameplate from the office door without a word. And my younger brother Marcus? He just shook his head and said, "I'd always been the dreamer, the one who couldn't handle the real world." I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss, but none of them were in that courtroom 3 months ago, when Judge Patricia Henley looked across the room, saw me sitting in the gallery, and her eyes went wide. None of them heard her voice crack when she said those 5 words that changed everything. "You're the Treasury Secretary. Let me take you back to where it all began. To the moment I stopped being the golden child and started being the family disappointment. My name is Jonathan Mitchell. I'm 38 years old, and I live in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, about 20 minutes from downtown Washington. The walls are lined with books on economic policy and international finance, not the leather-bound legal volumes my father expected to see. My coffee table holds reports from the Congressional Budget Office instead of case briefs. And every morning, I wake up to the sound of my neighbor's dog barking, make instant coffee in a mug that says "World's Okayest Economist," and remind myself that I made the right choice, even if my family has never understood it. Growing up in Greenwich, Connecticut, I was supposed to be the heir apparent to Mitchell & Associates, the prestigious law firm my grandfather founded in 1952. Third-generation lawyer, they said. It was practically written in stone. My childhood was filled with talk of billable hours, client acquisitions, and the importance of maintaining the family legacy. While other kids played video games, I was learning to draft contracts. While they went to summer camp, I was interning at the firm, filing documents, and watching my father command boardrooms with the kind of authority that made grown men nervous. I was good at it, too. Harvard Law School, summa cum laude, law review, a job offer from 3 different white shoe firms before I even graduated. My father's chest puffed with pride when I passed the bar exam on my first try. The golden boy was coming home. For 2 years I played the part perfectly. I wore the tailored suits, worked the 18-hour days, and billed enough hours to make the partners nod approvingly. I was on track for junior partner by 30, full partner by 35. The Mitchell name would continue to grace the letterhead for another generation. But somewhere between my 2nd and 3rd year, during a particularly brutal merger negotiation that kept me in the office for 72 straight hours, I realized I felt absolutely nothing. Not satisfaction, not accomplishment, not even fatigue. Just emptiness. I was 28 years old, making more money than most people see in a lifetime, and I felt like I was disappearing 1 billable hour at a time. The breaking point came during a family dinner at the Greenwich Country Club. My father was holding court at our usual table, telling the Pemberton family about my latest victory in corporate litigation. Mrs. Pemberton smiled and said, "Jonathan must be so proud to be carrying on the family tradition." And I opened my mouth to agree, to say the right thing, to play the part one more time. Instead, I said, "Actually, I'm thinking of leaving." The silence that followed was deafening. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My mother's smile froze in place. Marcus, who was 26 and fresh out of business school, looked at me like I'd just announced I was joining the circus. "Leaving?" my father said slowly. "Leaving for where? I'm not sure yet. Maybe government work, policy analysis. Something that actually mattered." My mother laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that cuts. "Government work? Jonathan, you can't be serious. You'd be throwing away everything we've built." "Everything you've built," I corrected quietly. "I never asked for any of this." That was the beginning of the end. Over the next 6 months, every family gathering became a negotiation session. My father would corner me with job offers from competing firms. My mother would casually mention the disappointment in her book club when she had to explain why her Harvard-educated son was considering public service. Marcus, Meanwhile, started positioning himself as the responsible son, the one who understood family obligations. The final straw came when I actually did it. I submitted my resignation letter on a Tuesday morning in March, cleaned out my office, and drove straight to Washington, D.C. I had a small savings account, a letter of recommendation from one of my law school professors, and absolutely no idea what I was doing. My father didn't speak to me for 8 months, but I found something in those early days in Washington that I'd never felt in the mahogany-paneled offices of Greenwich. Purpose. I started as a junior policy analyst at the Treasury Department, making about a quarter of what I'd earned at the law firm. My apartment was a studio in a building that smelled like old carpet and Chinese takeout. I took the metro to work every day, squeezed between commuters who looked just as tired as I felt, but somehow I was energized in a way I'd never been before. The work was different. Instead of helping corporations avoid taxes, I was analyzing how tax policy affected working families. Instead of structuring deals to maximize profits for shareholders, I was studying the impact of federal spending on infrastructure and education. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was building something instead of just maintaining it. My family, however, saw it differently. At Marcus's engagement party that December, I overheard my Aunt Helen talking to my cousin David. "Such a shame about Jonathan," she said, shaking her head. "All that potential wasted. Sarah tells me he's working for the government now, making practically nothing, and that apartment of his." She trailed off with a disapproving click of her tongue. I was standing right there, holding a glass of champagne that cost more than my monthly Metro pass, wearing a suit I'd bought off the rack at Men's Warehouse instead of having it tailored on Savile Row. For a moment, I considered walking over and explaining what I actually did, how policy analysis worked, why it mattered, but then I saw the look on my mother's face, that carefully composed expression that meant she was embarrassed but trying not to show it, and I decided to just stay quiet. That became my default mode at family gatherings. Quiet, polite, invisible. I'd show up, make small talk about the weather, and deflect questions about my work with vague responses about government stuff. It was easier than watching their faces when I tried to explain why I cared about marginal tax rates, or the intricacies of federal debt management. Meanwhile, Marcus was thriving. He'd joined a hedge fund straight out of Wharton, was making serious money, and had just proposed to Caroline Whitmore, whose father owned half of Fairfield County. The engagement party was held at the Whitmore estate, a sprawling Georgian mansion that made our Greenwich house look modest by comparison. Everyone was talking about the wedding, about Marcus's latest promotion, about the bright future ahead for the sensible Mitchell son. I spent most of that party on the terrace, looking out at the perfectly manicured gardens, and wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Inside, I could hear the laughter and conversation of people who all seemed to know exactly where they belonged in the world. And there I was, 31 years old, living paycheck to paycheck and apparently the family failure. Caroline's father, Judge Robert Whitmore, found me out there around midnight. He was a tall man with silver hair, and the kind of presence that made you straighten your shoulders without thinking about it. He'd been appointed to the federal bench 5 years earlier, and everyone spoke about him with the reverence reserved for someone who'd actually made it to the top. "Jonathan," he said, settling into the chair beside me. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I said automatically. "Beautiful party. You must be proud." He studied me for a moment. "Marcus tells me you're working in Washington now. Government work." Here it came, the polite dismissal, the gentle suggestion that I might want to reconsider my choices, the well-meaning advice about not wasting my potential. Instead, he said, "That's interesting. What kind of government work?" I was so surprised by the genuine curiosity in his voice that I actually answered honestly. "Treasury Department. Policy analysis. Mostly. I focus on fiscal policy impacts, federal spending efficiency, that sort of thing." "Ah," he said, leaning forward slightly. "So you're one of the people who actually understands how the money works." "I try to be." He nodded slowly. "That's important work, Jonathan. More important than most people realize. The folks who make policy decisions, judges, legislators, Executives. We all depend on people like you to tell us what the numbers actually mean. It was the first time in months that someone had talked about my work as if it mattered. I felt something loosen in my chest. Some knot of defensive tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Most people don't see it that way, I said. Most people don't understand it. He replied. They think government work is just bureaucracy and red tape. They don't realize that someone has to actually figure out how to make the country work, how to balance budgets, allocate resources, and make sure the whole system doesn't collapse under its own weight. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights of the estate reflect off the dark windows of the guest house. Finally, he stood up. For what it's worth, he said, I think you made the right choice. Not everyone is cut out for corporate law, and not everyone should be. The world needs people who understand the bigger picture. He walked back inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being understood. That conversation sustained me through the next several years, through the awkward family dinners where I was introduced as Jonathan, who works for the government, through the Christmas gatherings where my mother would quickly change the subject when people asked about my career, through the countless moments when I wondered if I'd thrown away my future for some misguided idealism, but I kept showing up, to family events, to Sunday dinners, to Marcus's wedding 2 years later. I wore my off-the-rack suits, made polite conversation, and maintained the role of the disappointing son who'd never quite lived up to his potential, because that's what disappointments do. We stay quiet, we stay polite, and we fade into the background while the successful members of the family take center stage. What they didn't know, what none of them bothered to ask about, was what I was actually building during those quiet years in Washington. The reports I was writing, the policies I was helping to shape, the slow, methodical work of becoming someone who truly understood how the American economy functioned at its deepest level. They saw the small apartment, and the government salary and the absence of a corporate title, and they assumed they knew the whole story. But sometimes the most important work happens in the spaces between what people can see and what they bother to look for. And sometimes, the person everyone has written off is quietly becoming exactly who they were always meant to be. Growing up in Millbrook, Colorado, meant everyone knew your business before you did. The Pierce family pharmacy sat on Main Street between Henley's Hardware and the First Baptist Church, and for 37 years it served as the unofficial town hall where people gathered to discuss everything from weather patterns to wedding plans. Dad knew which teenagers were struggling with acne, which elderly residents needed their medications delivered, and which families were going through rough patches based on their prescription patterns. I loved that pharmacy from the moment I could see over the counter. While other kids spent summers at the community pool or riding bikes through the foothills, I was in the back room learning to count pills, organize inventory, and most importantly, listening to Dad explain how different medications work. He had this way of breaking down complex pharmacology into simple terms, showing me how blood pressure medications opened up blood vessels like widening a garden hose, or how antibiotics were like sending a specialized army to fight specific types of infection. Mom worked at Millbrook Family Clinic, a small practice that served the entire valley. She'd come home with stories about delivering babies in the middle of blizzards, helping elderly farmers manage diabetes, and providing comfort to families dealing with terminal diagnosis. Her nursing bag sat by the front door, always packed and ready for emergency house calls that often lasted until dawn. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. During high school, I spent my afternoons at the clinic, initially just filing papers and answering phones, but Dr. Martinez, who'd been practicing in Millbrook since before I was born, took an interest in my curiosity about medical procedures. He'd let me observe routine checkups, explain what he was looking for during examinations, and quiz me on anatomy using the old skeleton model in his office. "You've got the instincts for this, Jonathan," he'd tell me while reviewing x-rays. "Not everyone can look at symptoms and see patterns the way you do." Those words meant everything to an 18-year-old who wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his life, but knew it had to involve helping people. The plan was simple: medical school, residency in family medicine, then return to Millbrook to eventually take over Dr. Martinez's practice. It was a path that made sense to everyone, including me. Rachel was 2 years older and had already established herself as the responsible one in our family. She'd graduated valedictorian, earned a scholarship to Colorado State for education, and returned home to teach third grade at Millbrook Elementary. Her wedding to Derek Thompson was the social event of the year, a church ceremony followed by a reception in the high school gymnasium that the entire town attended. Michael was 3 years younger, and from the age of 12, he'd shown no interest in anything beyond the pharmacy. While I was at the clinic learning about patient care, he was perfecting inventory systems and customer service skills. Dad used to joke that Michael was born to be a pharmacist, while I was born to be a doctor, and together we'd provide comprehensive healthcare to Millbrook for the next generation. The family dynamic was comfortable and predictable. Sunday dinners at Mom and Dad's house where we'd discuss our weeks, share town gossip, and plan for holidays. Summer barbecues where neighbors dropped by without invitation. Christmas mornings where we'd open presents before heading to church together. It was the kind of stable, rooted life that people write songs about. Johns Hopkins changed everything. Medical school in Baltimore was like stepping into an alternate universe where everything moved faster, demanded more, and connected to a larger world I'd never imagined. The diversity of my classmates was overwhelming. People from major cities, different countries, backgrounds I'd only read about in books. My roommate was from Los Angeles, spoke 3 languages, and had worked in refugee camps before starting medical school. "You're from where?" became a common question when I mentioned Millbrook. The idea of a town with 8,000 people seemed quaint to classmates who'd grown up in cities with populations in the millions. But it was during my public health rotation, in my 3rd year, that everything shifted. I was assigned to work with Dr. Patricia Valdez, an epidemiologist who was tracking a tuberculosis outbreak in Baltimore's immigrant communities. For 6 weeks, I followed her through overcrowded apartments, community health centers, and policy meetings where public health officials debated resource allocation. Dr. Valdez showed me how a single policy change, improving ventilation standards in low-income housing, could prevent hundreds of cases of TB. She explained how vaccination programs could eliminate diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries. She demonstrated how epidemiological data could predict and prevent outbreaks before they started. Individual patient care is crucial, she told me during one late-night strategy session. But population health is where we can change the trajectory of human suffering on a massive scale. I watched her coordinate with housing authorities, immigration services, school districts, and community organizations to contain the outbreak. She wasn't just treating patients, she was orchestrating systematic changes that would protect entire communities for generations. It was medicine, but medicine amplified beyond anything I'd imagined possible. When I called home to discuss adding a public health track to my medical training, the response was immediate and negative. Public health? Dad's voice carried the skepticism that would define our relationship for the next 15 years. "That's not medicine, Jonathan. That's politics." "It's preventive medicine, Dad. Instead of treating one patient with diabetes, you create programs that prevent diabetes in thousands of people. But you're not actually treating anyone. You're making policies about treating people. There's a difference." Mom was more diplomatic, but equally concerned. "Are you sure this is what you want? You've always been so good with individual patients. Remember how you helped Mrs. Henderson understand her medications? Or how you comforted the Williams family when their father was dying? That's your gift, Jonathan. Personal connection." Rachel was blunt. "It sounds like you're looking for an excuse to avoid the hard work of actually practicing medicine." The conversation ended with reluctant agreement that I could explore public health as long as I didn't abandon my plans to return to Millbrook. But even that compromise felt like failure to them. In their minds, I was already moving away from my calling, distracted by academic prestige and big city thinking. My 4th year included a rotation with the CDC in Atlanta, where I worked on childhood immunization programs. I spent 3 months analyzing vaccination rates across different communities. identifying barriers to access, and developing strategies to improve coverage. The work was intellectually challenging and emotionally satisfying in ways I hadn't expected. I helped design a mobile vaccination clinic program that reached rural communities across the Southeast. I co-authored a study on vaccine hesitancy that influenced national communication strategies. I participated in emergency response exercises that simulated disease outbreaks and coordinated multi-state responses. Every accomplishment felt significant, but also felt like a step further away from the life my family expected me to live. When I tried to explain the impact of the immunization program during Christmas dinner, Rachel interrupted. "How many individual children did you personally vaccinate?" "That's not the point, Rachel. The program I helped develop will vaccinate hundreds of thousands of children across multiple states." "But you didn't personally give any vaccines. You just planned for other people to give vaccines." Michael nodded in agreement. "It's like the difference between actually filling prescriptions and writing policies about how prescriptions should be filled." Dad remained diplomatically silent, but his expression made his opinion clear. I was becoming something they didn't recognize, pursuing achievements they couldn't measure in terms they understood. The final break came during my residency when I decided to pursue an epidemiology fellowship instead of family medicine. The conversation with my family was the most difficult part of my life. "You're abandoning medicine," Rachel said flatly. "Everything we've talked about, everything you've worked toward, everything this family stands for, you're just throwing it away for some government job." "I'm not abandoning medicine. I'm expanding it." "No, Jonathan, you're running away from it. You're running away from the responsibility of actually caring for people, because it's easier to sit in meetings and write reports than it is to hold someone's hand while they're dying." Her words cut deeper than she probably intended, because they touched on my own uncertainties. Was I pursuing population health because I believed in its impact? Or because I was afraid of the emotional demands of direct patient care? Was I choosing policy work because it felt more intellectually prestigious than small-town family medicine? Those doubts followed me through my fellowship, through my early years at the CDC, through my promotion to state health officer, and eventually to my nomination as Surgeon General. Every professional achievement was accompanied by the nagging question of whether I was actually making a difference or just convincing myself that bureaucratic work was equivalent to medical practice. The irony was that my work touched more lives than I ever could have reached in Millbrook. The childhood obesity prevention programs I'd helped develop were implemented in schools across 43 states. The vaccination strategies I'd co-authored had increased immunization rates in underserved communities by 30%. The emergency preparedness protocols I'd written had guided responses to 3 major disease outbreaks, but none of that mattered to my family, because they couldn't see it, couldn't touch it, couldn't point to a specific person and say, "Jonathan saved that life." The distance between us grew with each promotion, each recognition, each step further into a world they didn't understand. Visits home became exercises in careful conversation, avoiding topics that might lead to arguments about my career choices. I learned to deflect questions about my work, to minimize my achievements, to pretend that my job was less important than it actually was. By the time I was nominated for Surgeon General, the pattern was firmly established. They were proud of me in the abstract way. You're proud of a distant relative who achieves something notable, but they didn't really understand what I did or why it mattered. The confirmation hearings were broadcast on C-SPAN, but when I called home afterward, no one mentioned watching them. My swearing-in ceremony was attended by cabinet members, congressional leaders, and public health officials from around the world, but my family had scheduling conflicts that prevented them from attending. "We're proud of you, honey," Mom had said during a brief phone call afterward. "It's just hard to understand exactly what a Surgeon General does." What a Surgeon General does, I wanted to tell her, is exactly what I'd been trying to explain for 15 years. We analyze threats to public health, we develop policies to protect communities, we coordinate responses to health crises, we advocate for preventive medicine on a national scale. We practice medicine, just on a scope they'd never imagined possible. But sitting in that hospital waiting room, watching Emma struggle to breathe while my family treated me like an unwelcome observer, All of that expertise felt useless. I was the chief medical officer of the United States. But I couldn't help my own niece because my family had decided long ago that I'd stopped being a real doctor the day I chose policy over patients. The tragedy wasn't that they were wrong about my abilities. The tragedy was that I'd started to believe they might be right. The first sign that my relationship with my family had fundamentally changed came during Emma's second birthday party. I'd flown in from Washington where I'd been coordinating the federal response to a multi-state E. coli outbreak. But when I mentioned why I'd arrived late, Rachel's expression hardened. "Always something more important than family," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'd spent the previous 72 hours working with state health departments to trace the source of contaminated lettuce that had sickened over 200 people across 6 states. We'd identified the farm, coordinated the recall, and prevented what could have been thousands of additional cases. But explaining that would only prove Rachel's point about prioritizing strangers over family. Emma had toddled over to me, arms outstretched, completely unaware of the tension in the room. As I picked her up, she babbled happily about the cartoon characters on her birthday cake. For a moment, watching her tiny fingers trace the frosting decorations, I felt the pure joy of being someone's favorite uncle. Then Derek spoke up. "Maybe Uncle John can explain to Emma what a Surgeon General does, since none of us really understand." The comment was designed to sting, and it worked. Derek had always resented what he saw as my abandonment of family values, but since Emma's birth, his criticism had become more pointed. He'd taken on the role of protective father figure, positioning himself as the one who truly understood what mattered in life. "Uncle John works in Washington," I said simply, tickling Emma's chin. "He helps keep people healthy by going to meetings," Derek added. "Lots and lots of meetings." Rachel laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. "Remember when you used to want to be a real doctor, John? Back when you actually cared about helping individual people." The conversation continued around me as I held Emma, but I'd stopped participating. This had become the pattern at every family gathering. Subtle digs about my career choices, questioning comments about my priorities, and the underlying assumption that I'd traded meaningful work for prestigious titles. Michael tried to play peacekeeper, as he always did. "John's helping people just on a bigger scale," he offered weakly. "Is he, though?" Derek pressed. "When's the last time he actually treated a patient? When's the last time he saved someone's life directly?" The irony was crushing. 2 days earlier, I'd been in the Situation Room briefing the president on pandemic preparedness. The policies I'd helped develop had quite literally saved thousands of lives during the recent flu season. But none of that registered as real medical work to my family. As Emma's party wound down, I found myself helping clean up in the kitchen while the adults continued their conversations in the living room. Mom joined me, drying dishes with the same methodical precision she'd used for 40 years. "You know they don't mean to hurt you," she said quietly. "Don't they?" She was silent for a long moment, concentrating on a particularly stubborn spot on a plate. "Rachel's scared, John. She sees how the world is changing, how complicated everything is becoming. Your success makes her feel like maybe she chose wrong by staying here." "My success isn't a judgment on her choices, Mom. I know that. You know that. But she doesn't see it that way." The conversation revealed something I'd been trying to ignore. My family's resentment wasn't just about my career choices. It was about what those choices represented. Every achievement in my professional life was interpreted as evidence that I thought I was better than them, that I'd outgrown Millbrook and the values they held dear. The misunderstandings multiplied over the following months. When I was interviewed on national television about childhood vaccination rates, Derek posted on Facebook about so-called experts who don't have children giving parenting advice. When I testified before Congress about healthcare access in rural communities, Rachel commented to neighbors that I'd forgotten where I came from. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving dinner the year Emma turned 4. I'd been working on a comprehensive study of pediatric obesity rates in rural communities, research that would directly benefit places like Millbrook. The data was alarming. Children in small towns were developing type 2 diabetes at unprecedented rates, largely due to limited access to fresh foods and safe recreational spaces. I thought my family would be interested in the findings, since they affected their own community. Instead, my explanation of the research was met with defensive hostility. "So you're saying we're bad parents?" Rachel snapped. "I'm saying there are systemic issues that make it harder for parents in rural communities to keep their children healthy." "Systemic issues," Derek repeated mockingly. "Everything's a system with you, isn't it? Can't just be that some parents don't care enough to feed their kids right." "It's not about individual responsibility, Derek. It's about access. When the nearest grocery store with fresh produce is 40 miles away, when there are no safe places for children to play outside, when school lunch programs are underfunded—" "There you go again," Rachel interrupted, "making excuses, blaming everything except the people making the choices." Dad, who'd been quietly eating his turkey, finally spoke up. "In my day, we didn't need the government to tell us how to raise healthy children." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd achieved, dismissed as government overreach by the man who'd inspired my interest in healthcare in the first place. "Dad, I'm not telling anyone how to raise their children. I'm trying to create conditions where all children have the same opportunities to be healthy." "By writing reports and giving speeches," Rachel added. "When's the last time you actually helped a child, John? Directly, personally, not through some program or policy, but with your own hands?" The question haunted me because I couldn't answer it satisfactorily. Yes, I'd examined children during my residency rotations. Yes, I'd provided medical care during disaster response exercises. But my daily work involved population health, not individual patients. I influenced the care of millions of children, but I couldn't point to a specific child and say, "I saved that life with my own hands." Emma, oblivious to the tension, had fallen asleep in my lap during the argument. Her small body was warm and trusting, her breathing steady and peaceful. Looking down at her, I felt a profound sense of protectiveness mixed with professional concern. At 4 years old, she was already showing early signs of the health challenges I'd been studying. A diet heavy in processed foods, limited physical activity, irregular sleep patterns, but suggesting any of this to Rachel and Derek would only confirm their belief that I'd become an outsider who saw their family as a case study, rather than people I loved. The visits home became increasingly strained. I'd arrive with gifts for Emma, stories about my work that no one wanted to hear, and a growing sense that I was performing the role of family member rather than actually being one. Conversations became careful dances around topics that might trigger arguments about my career, my priorities, or my apparent disconnection from real life. Rachel started scheduling Emma's activities during my visits. Birthday parties for classmates I'd never met, playdates with families who didn't know I existed, trips to Denver that coincidentally coincided with my time at home. The message was clear: Emma's life was full and complete without me in it. Michael remained neutral but distant, treating me like a semi-famous relative who occasionally visited rather than his brother. He'd ask polite questions about Washington, listen to abbreviated answers, then change the subject to pharmacy business or local gossip. Our relationship had become pleasant but superficial, lacking the easy camaraderie we'd shared growing up. The professional isolation was almost worse than the family tension. As Surgeon General, I was surrounded by brilliant colleagues who understood the importance of our work, but I was also increasingly removed from direct patient care. My days were filled with briefings, policy reviews, congressional testimonies, and strategic planning sessions. I influenced healthcare on a massive scale, but I rarely saw the faces of the people I was helping. During a particularly difficult week, budget hearings where politicians questioned the value of prevention programs, a measles outbreak that could have been prevented with better vaccination rates, and a family phone call where Emma had forgotten to say goodbye to me, I found myself questioning everything. Was Rachel right? Had I chosen the easier path by pursuing policy work instead of direct patient care? Was I hiding behind the prestige of my title to avoid the emotional demands of individual medicine? Had I convinced myself that population health was more important because it allowed me to maintain professional distance from human suffering? The doubts multiplied during sleepless nights in my Georgetown apartment. I'd review the day's accomplishments, perhaps a new initiative to improve maternal mortality rates, or a briefing that would influence nationwide health policy, and wonder if any of it mattered as much as sitting beside a sick child's bedside, holding a frightened parent's hand, or explaining a diagnosis with compassion and clarity. My personal life reflected the same isolation I felt professionally. Relationships had been difficult to maintain, given the demands of my career and the constant travel. Friends from medical school had mostly stayed in clinical practice, and while they respected my achievements, they often seemed as puzzled by my career path as my family was. I'd become successful by every external measure: recognized expertise, national influence, financial security, but I felt increasingly disconnected from the human elements that had originally drawn me to medicine. The irony was bitter. In trying to help more people than I ever could have reached in Millbrook, I'd lost touch with the individual connections that made medicine meaningful. The final straw came during Emma's 5th birthday party, when she introduced me to her friends as Uncle John, who lives far away. Not Uncle John the doctor, or even Uncle John who works in Washington, just someone who lived far away, as if geography was the only thing that defined our relationship. Rachel watched the introduction with something that looked like satisfaction. She'd succeeded in redefining my role in Emma's life, from beloved uncle to distant relative, from family member to occasional visitor. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by old trophies and medical school textbooks, I wondered if I'd made the wrong choices. Not just about my career, but about what I'd sacrificed to pursue it. I'd gained the ability to influence healthcare for millions of Americans, but I'd lost the trust and respect of the people I loved most. The question that kept me awake wasn't whether my work was important. I knew it was. The question was whether importance was enough to justify the relationships I'd damaged and the connections I'd severed in pursuit of it. 3 months later, Emma would be rushed to Denver Children's Hospital with symptoms I could diagnose immediately, but wasn't trusted to identify. The very expertise my family dismissed would become the only thing standing between their child and a potentially fatal misdiagnosis. But that night, all I knew was that I'd become a stranger in my own family, a success story that felt like a failure in all the ways that truly mattered. The call came at 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday while I was reviewing mortality statistics from the latest influenza season. Rachel's voice was different, not angry or dismissive, but genuinely frightened in a way I hadn't heard since we were children. "John, something's wrong with Emma. Really wrong." I closed my laptop immediately, giving her my full attention. "What are her symptoms?" "She's been sick for 3 days. Started with what we thought was just a cold, but now she's having trouble breathing. The doctor in Millbrook said it was probably just a bad virus, but Derek thinks we should bring her to Denver." I don't know what to do. Every detail she described activated my diagnostic training: fever progression, respiratory distress, specific cough patterns. The constellation of symptoms pointed towards something serious that required immediate intervention. "Rachel, you need to get her to Denver Children's Hospital tonight. Don't wait until morning. The doctor here said it wasn't urgent. Derek thinks I'm overreacting." The doctor in Millbrook isn't a pediatric specialist. Emma needs to be evaluated by someone who sees these cases regularly. There was silence on the line, and I could hear Derek's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. When Rachel spoke again, her tone had shifted back to the familiar skepticism. "Derek says you're just trying to scare us. He thinks you want us to panic so you can swoop in and play hero doctor." The accusation hit like a physical blow. My niece was displaying symptoms of what I suspected was bacterial pneumonia with possible complications, and they were filtering my medical advice through years of family resentment. "Rachel, this isn't about me. Emma's breathing pattern, the fever progression you described, the specific type of cough, these are indicators of a serious respiratory infection that can escalate quickly in children. You haven't even seen her, John. You're making diagnoses over the phone based on me describing symptoms I probably can't even explain properly." She was right about one thing. I was making assessments based on secondhand information. But 30 years of medical training, including specialized knowledge of pediatric emergency conditions, gave me confidence in my clinical judgment. The problem was that my family had spent so many years dismissing my expertise that they couldn't recognize when I was functioning as a doctor rather than an overbearing relative. "Fine," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Don't take my word for it. But please at least call the pediatric emergency line at Denver Children's and describe her symptoms to them. Get a second opinion from someone who specializes in children's respiratory conditions." We already got a second opinion. Dr. Morrison examined her this afternoon and said to monitor her at home. Dr. Morrison was 73 years old and hadn't updated his pediatric training since the 1980s. He was a good family practitioner for routine care, but pediatric emergency medicine had evolved significantly in the past decade. The protocols I'd helped develop for identifying severe respiratory infections in children included warning signs that older physicians might not recognize as urgent. "Rachel, please. I'm begging you. Just drive to Denver and have her evaluated by a pediatric emergency specialist. If I'm wrong, you've wasted a few hours. If I'm right." I didn't finish the sentence. The implications hung between us like a dare. "If you're so concerned," Derek's voice came on the line. He'd taken the phone from Rachel. "Why don't you come here and examine her yourself?" "Oh wait, you can't, because you're not a practicing physician anymore. You're a bureaucrat who's forgotten how to actually treat patients." The line went dead. I sat in my apartment, staring at the phone, my hands trembling slightly. Every instinct I'd developed over 3 decades in medicine was screaming that Emma needed immediate medical attention, but my family's distrust of my judgment meant they were willing to risk their daughter's health rather than accept my assessment. I called back immediately. No answer. I tried Rachel's cell phone, straight to voicemail. I called the house phone again and left a message. "Rachel, I'm flying to Denver tonight. I'll be at Children's Hospital. Please, just bring Emma in for evaluation." The next flight from Washington to Denver wasn't until 6 a.m., but I was at Reagan National by 3 a.m., hoping for an earlier connection or standby seat. During the layover in Chicago, I called Dr. Sarah Chen, the chief of pediatric emergency medicine at Denver Children's Hospital. Sarah and I had worked together on national pediatric emergency protocols, and I trusted her judgment implicitly. "Sarah, it's John Pierce. I'm flying to Denver because my niece is showing symptoms that concern me, but the family is resistant to bringing her in for evaluation." I described Emma's symptoms as Rachel had relayed them to me. Sarah's response was immediate and alarming. "John, those symptoms in a 7-year-old require urgent evaluation. If the family won't bring her in voluntarily, you might need to consider other options." "What other options?" "Depending on the state laws, if you believe a child is in immediate danger due to medical neglect, you can request a welfare check, but that's obviously a nuclear option with family relationships." The thought of calling Child Protective Services on my own sister was unthinkable, but the alternative, Emma suffering serious complications from a treatable condition, was worse. During the flight to Denver, I reviewed everything I knew about pediatric respiratory emergencies: Emma's age, the symptom progression Rachel had described, the timeline of her illness. Everything pointed toward bacterial pneumonia, possibly with early signs of sepsis. Without proper antibiotic treatment, her condition could deteriorate rapidly. I landed in Denver at 1:15 p.m. and went straight to Children's Hospital. Sarah met me in the emergency department, her expression grave. "Any word from your family?" "Nothing. They're not answering my calls." "John, I've been thinking about this since we talked. If your clinical assessment is correct, and if the child's condition is deteriorating, time is critical. Is there any way to convince them to come in?" I was about to answer when my phone rang. "Rachel's number, John." Her voice was panicked now, all pretense of skepticism gone. "Emma's gotten worse. Her breathing is really labored, and she's burning up with fever. Derek says we should still wait, but I'm scared." "Where are you?" "We're at home. Emma's lying on the couch, and she just looks so sick. I don't know what to do." "Rachel, get in the car right now. Drive straight to Denver Children's Hospital." Don't stop. Don't hesitate. Just come now. Derek says the drive will be too stressful for her. He thinks we should call an ambulance if it's really that serious. An ambulance from Millbrook to Denver will take too long. You can be here in 90 minutes if you leave right now. I could hear heated discussion in the background, Derek arguing that I was overreacting. Rachel torn between her trust in her husband and her fear for her daughter. Rachel, listen to me. I'm at Children's Hospital right now. I've spoken with the chief of pediatric emergency medicine. She's agreed to see Emma immediately when you arrive. No waiting, no delays, but you have to come now. You're already there? I flew in this morning because I was worried about Emma. There was a long pause. When Rachel spoke again, her voice was small and uncertain. You really think it's that serious? I think Emma needs medical attention that she can't get in Millbrook. I think waiting could be dangerous. Another pause, more heated discussion in the background, then Rachel's voice, stronger now. We're coming. Derek's not happy about it. But we're coming. Drive carefully but quickly. Call me when you're 10 minutes away. After hanging up, Sarah looked at me with professional concern. You realize that if you're wrong about this, your relationship with your family will never recover. If I'm wrong, Emma will be fine and they'll have every right to never trust my judgment again. And if you're right, if I'm right, we might save her life. The next 90 minutes were the longest of my professional career. I'd made life and death decisions in crisis situations, coordinated responses to public health emergencies, and briefed presidents on pandemic preparedness. But I'd never felt the weight of responsibility the way I did waiting for my family to arrive with a sick child whose condition I'd diagnosed over the phone. Sarah had prepared the emergency team for Emma's arrival. Pediatric respiratory specialists were on standby, diagnostic equipment was ready, and a treatment room was reserved. If my assessment was correct, Emma would receive immediate care. If I was wrong, I'd subjected my family to unnecessary panic and further damaged our already fragile relationship. At 3:47 p.m., my phone rang. John, we're in the parking lot. Emma's really struggling to breathe. Derek had to carry her from the car. Come straight to the emergency entrance. Tell them you're the Pierce family, and they'll take you directly to Dr. Chen. I watched from the hallway as they wheeled Emma into the treatment room. Even from a distance, I could see the labored breathing, the pallor, the signs of a child in respiratory distress. My diagnostic assessment had been conservative. She was sicker than I'd realized. Derek's face was ashen as he carried Emma, his earlier skepticism replaced by fear. Rachel walked beside them, her hand on Emma's forehead, whispering reassurances that sounded more like prayers. As the medical team took over Emma's care, I stood in the hallway, no longer the Surgeon General or the family disappointment, but simply an uncle who'd recognized that the child he loved was in danger and had done everything in his power to help her. The next few hours would determine whether my medical judgment had been sound, whether my family would finally understand the depth of my expertise, and whether Emma would recover from what I suspected was a life-threatening infection that could have been fatal if left untreated. For the first time in 15 years, my role as a doctor and my identity as a family member were aligned in the same desperate hope that I'd been right about the diagnosis, and that we'd acted quickly enough to save her. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from Emma's treatment room 47 minutes after my family had arrived, her expression serious but not grave. I'd been pacing the hallway, close enough to hear the urgent medical conversations but far enough away to respect my family's space and the medical team's need to work without interference. How is she? Rachel asked immediately. Derek standing rigid beside her. Emma has bacterial pneumonia with early signs of sepsis, Dr. Chen explained. Serious, but we caught it in time. We've started her on IV antibiotics and respiratory support. Her oxygen levels are already improving. The relief on Rachel's face was immediate, but Derek's expression remained skeptical. How serious is it? Are you saying she could have? If left untreated for another 12 to 24 hours, yes, this could have become life-threatening. Sepsis in children can progress very rapidly. Rachel sank into a nearby chair, the full weight of the situation hitting her. The doctor in Millbrook said it was just a virus. He said to give it a few more days. Dr. Chen glanced toward me, then back to my family. Viral and bacterial respiratory infections can look very similar in the early stages. It takes specific training in pediatric emergency medicine to distinguish the warning signs. The symptoms your brother described over the phone were classic indicators of bacterial pneumonia in a child Emma's age. My brother, Derek's voice sharpened. What do you mean, the symptoms he described? Dr. Chen paused, clearly realizing she'd revealed something my family didn't know. Dr. Pierce called me yesterday morning. After speaking with you, he was concerned enough about Emma's condition to fly here from Washington. Dr. Pierce? Rachel looked confused. You mean John? Dr. Jonathan Pierce? Yes. He consulted with me about Emma's symptoms and asked me to be prepared for her arrival. Derek's face was shifting through a series of emotions: confusion, recognition, and something that might have been embarrassment. Wait, John is a doctor here. Dr. Pierce isn't on staff here, but he's well known in pediatric emergency medicine circles. His work on national emergency protocols has influenced how we handle cases like Emma's. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel stared at Dr. Chen as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. I don't understand, Rachel said slowly. John works for the government. He's not a practicing doctor. Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. Dr. Pierce is the Surgeon General of the United States. He's one of the most respected physicians in the country, particularly in public health and emergency medicine. I watched from down the hallway as this information hit my family like a physical blow. Derek actually took a step backward. Rachel's mouth opened and closed without sound. The Surgeon General, Derek repeated slowly. Like the actual Surgeon General? Yes, he's the Chief Medical Officer for the entire United States. His expertise in pediatric emergency protocols is why I trusted his assessment of Emma's condition sight unseen. Rachel turned to look down the hallway where I'd been standing, her eyes wide with something between shock and recognition. For the first time in years, she was seeing me not as her disappointing brother who'd abandoned family medicine, but as the physician who'd potentially saved her daughter's life. He flew here from Washington because he was worried about Emma, she asked quietly. He was on a plane 6 hours after your phone call. Said he couldn't risk being wrong about the diagnosis. Derek ran his hand through his hair, his usual confidence completely shaken. I told him he wasn't a real doctor anymore. I said he was just a bureaucrat who'd forgotten how to treat patients. Dr. Chen's expression remained professionally neutral, but there was a slight edge to her voice. Dr. Pierce has saved more lives through his policy work and emergency protocols than most physicians will in their entire careers. But yesterday he wasn't functioning as the Surgeon General. He was functioning as an uncle who recognized that his niece was seriously ill. Can we see her? Rachel asked, her voice small. She's stable now, but we'll need to monitor her closely for the next 24 hours. The antibiotics should continue improving her condition, but pneumonia in children requires careful observation. As Dr. Chen led my family into Emma's room, I remained in the hallway, processing the conversation I'd just overheard. My family had spent 15 years dismissing my medical expertise, convinced that I'd abandoned real medicine for political prestige. Now they were learning that the brother they'd written off as a government bureaucrat was actually one of the most senior physicians in the country. Through the glass window of Emma's room, I could see her lying in the hospital bed, oxygen tubes in her nose, IV lines in her small arm. She looked fragile but alert, her color already better than when she'd arrived. Rachel sat beside the bed, holding her hand, while Derek stood against the wall, his expression troubled. I'd done what I came to do. Emma was receiving proper medical care, her condition was improving, and my family now understood the seriousness of her illness. But I wasn't sure how to handle the revelation about my professional identity. For years, I'd allowed them to minimize my achievements rather than confront their misunderstanding directly. Dr. Chen appeared in the hallway, closing the door to Emma's room behind her. That was awkward, she said with characteristic directness. They really didn't know who you were? They knew I was Surgeon General. They just didn't understand what that meant. How is that possible? You're one of the most visible physicians in the country. I leaned against the wall. suddenly exhausted. They see the title as political, not medical. To them, I stopped being a doctor when I left clinical practice. But you never stopped being a doctor. You just expanded your practice to include 33 million patients. Her words hit harder than I'd expected. For years, I'd questioned whether my family was right about my career choices, whether I'd traded meaningful medicine for bureaucratic prestige. But standing in that hospital, having potentially saved my niece's life through the exact expertise my family had dismissed, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. "The little girl is asking for you," Dr. Chen added. "She wants to thank the uncle who helped her feel better." Walking into Emma's room felt like crossing a threshold. I couldn't cross. Rachel looked up as I entered, her eyes red but no longer hostile. "John," she said, and her voice carried a weight of acknowledgement I hadn't heard in years. "Dr. Chen told us what you did. Flying here, arranging for Emma's care, recognizing how sick she was when we couldn't see it." Emma turned her head toward me, a small smile on her pale face. "Uncle John, the doctor said, you're the one who knew I was really sick." I sat on the edge of her bed, taking her small hand in mine. "I just wanted to make sure you got the best care possible, sweetheart. Are you a doctor too?" The question was innocent, but it hung in the air like a challenge. I looked at Rachel, then at Derek, both of whom were watching my response carefully. "Yes, Emma, I'm a doctor, a different kind of doctor than the ones here, but a doctor." "What kind of doctor?" "I'm the kind of doctor who tries to keep all the children in America healthy." Emma considered this seriously. "Like all the children? I try to. That's my job." Derek stepped forward, his expression sheepish. "John, I owe you an apology. We owe you an apology. I had no idea. I mean, we knew you had an important job, but we didn't understand." "You didn't understand because I never explained it properly," I said. "I let you think my work was less important than it is because it was easier than having the same argument over and over." Rachel was crying now, not the angry tears I'd seen during our arguments, but tears of genuine remorse. "You saved her life. You diagnosed her over the phone from 1,000 miles away, and you saved her life. Dr. Chen and her team saved her life. I just recognized the symptoms." "No," Rachel said firmly. "If you hadn't pushed us to come here, if you hadn't flown out to make sure she got immediate care, if you hadn't—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Derek sat down heavily in the chair across from Emma's bed. "I called you a bureaucrat who'd forgotten how to treat patients." "Jesus, John. The Surgeon General. You're the Surgeon General, and I told you that you weren't a real doctor." "You didn't know. I should have known. We should have known." He looked at Emma, then back at me. "How do we make this right?" The question hung between us, loaded with 15 years of misunderstanding, resentment, and missed opportunities. I'd spent so long trying to prove my worth to my family that I'd forgotten they needed to understand my work before they could appreciate it. "We start by having honest conversations," I said, "about what I do, why it matters, and how we can support each other better." Emma tugged on my hand. "Uncle John, will you visit me more now? If your mom and dad want me to, sweetheart." Rachel wiped her eyes. "Of course we want you to. We want you to be part of Emma's life. Part of our lives. We need to learn how to do this better." A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Excuse me, Dr. Pierce. There are some reporters in the lobby asking about your presence here." Something about the Surgeon General making an emergency trip to Denver. The reminder of my public role brought reality crashing back. My impromptu flight to Denver, my consultation with hospital staff, Emma's case. It would all become public eventually, but for the first time, I didn't care about the public relations implications. "Tell them Dr. Pierce is here in a personal capacity, caring for a family member," I said. "No interviews, no statements." As the nurse left, Derek shook his head in amazement. "Reporters? Because you're here? I still can't wrap my head around this." "It's just a job, Derek. An important job, but still just a job. What matters is that Emma is going to be okay." But even as I said it, I knew something fundamental had shifted. My family was seeing me clearly for the first time in years, not as the disappointing son who'd abandoned them, but as the physician who'd used every resource at his disposal to protect the child we all loved. The revelation wasn't just about my professional identity, it was about the realization that love and expertise could coexist, that my commitment to public health hadn't diminished my capacity for personal care, and that sometimes the most important diagnosis you make is the one that saves someone you can't bear to lose. The hotel room near Denver Children's Hospital became our temporary family headquarters for the next 4 days, while Emma recovered. Rachel had insisted I stay close by, and for the first time in over a decade, I found myself in the unusual position of being not just welcome, but specifically requested at family gatherings. On the second morning, while Emma slept peacefully with her oxygen levels finally stabilized, Derek approached me in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of coffee and an expression I'd never seen before. Genuine humility mixed with curiosity. "John, can I ask you something?" Without sounding like a complete idiot. "You've never sounded like an idiot, Derek." Skeptical, maybe, but not an idiot. He sat down across from me, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "What does the Surgeon General actually do? I mean, I know it's an important job, but I realize I don't understand what your day-to-day work looks like." The question was simple, but it represented a seismic shift in our relationship. For 15 years, Derek had dismissed my career without ever asking what it entailed. Now, faced with the evidence of my medical expertise, he wanted to understand. Yesterday, before Rachel called, I was reviewing data on childhood vaccination rates in rural communities, I began. "We're seeing concerning drops in immunization coverage that could lead to outbreaks of preventable diseases." "Like what kind of diseases?" "Measles, whooping cough, bacterial meningitis, diseases that can kill children if they spread through unvaccinated populations." Derek's expression grew serious. "And your job is to prevent that?" "My job is to analyze the data, understand why vaccination rates are dropping, develop strategies to address the barriers, and coordinate with state health departments to implement solutions." "So you're like a doctor for entire states." "More like a doctor for the entire country. I advise the president on health threats, coordinate responses to disease outbreaks, develop national health policies, and oversee the U.S. Public Health Service." Derek was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "Last year, when there was that E. coli outbreak from the lettuce, and all the grocery stores pulled their products, I coordinated that response. We traced the contamination to its source, worked with the FDA to issue the recall, and prevented what could have been thousands of additional cases." "Jesus. And we thought you just went to meetings all day." The conversation continued for over an hour as Derek asked detailed questions about pandemic preparedness, public health emergencies, and the scope of federal health policy. With each answer, I watched his understanding of my work deepen, along with his embarrassment about years of dismissive comments. "Derek, I don't need you to be embarrassed about not understanding my job. I never explained it clearly because I got tired of defending it. But that's just it," he said, leaning forward. "You shouldn't have had to defend it. We should have asked more questions, tried to understand, shown some basic respect for what you'd accomplished." That afternoon, Rachel joined us for a longer conversation that proved even more difficult. We sat in Emma's room while she napped, speaking in quiet voices about years of accumulated misunderstandings. "I need to tell you something," Rachel began, her voice hesitant. "The reason I was so critical of your career choice wasn't really about you abandoning medicine. It was about you abandoning us." "What do you mean?" "When you left for medical school, I was so proud. My little brother was going to be a doctor, just like he'd always dreamed. But then you kept going to more schools, taking jobs further away, accepting positions that made you more and more important and less available to us." She paused, watching Emma's peaceful breathing. "Every achievement you had felt like another step away from our family. Every promotion meant you were too important for small-town problems. I started resenting your success because it felt like success at our expense." "Rachel, I never meant for it to feel that way. I know that now. But at the time, it felt like you were choosing prestige over people, choosing career advancement over family connections. The insight was painful because it contained more truth than I wanted to acknowledge. In pursuing positions of greater influence and responsibility, I had become less available to my family. Conference calls during holidays, emergency briefings during family visits, the constant demands of a job that never truly stopped. You're right, I admitted. I did choose career over family in many ways. Not because I loved you less, but because I convinced myself that the work was more important than individual relationships. And I convinced myself that your work was less important than it actually was, because it made me feel better about being ignored. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the complex dynamics that had driven us apart. Emma stirred in her sleep, her small hand reaching for the stuffed elephant I'd brought her from the hospital gift shop. She asked me yesterday if you were famous, Rachel said with a slight smile. What did you tell her? I told her that Uncle John is very good at his job, and that his job is helping sick children all over America get better. That's a good explanation. She wanted to know if that meant you were like a superhero doctor. I laughed quietly. What did you say to that? I said yes, because that's what you are. Isn't it? You're a doctor who helps millions of people instead of dozens. The third day brought a conversation with my parents that I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Mom and Dad had driven up from Millbrook after learning about Emma's hospitalization, and their reaction to discovering my true professional standing had been characteristically reserved but profound. We met in the hospital chapel, a quiet space where serious conversations felt appropriate. Dad sat stiffly in the pew, his hands folded in his lap, while Mom twisted her wedding ring in the nervous gesture. I remembered from childhood. Son, Dad began, his voice carrying a weight I'd rarely heard before. Your mother and I owe you an explanation, and an apology. Dad, you don't need to. Yes, we do. He turned to face me directly. We spent so many years being disappointed that you weren't the doctor we'd imagined you'd become that we never took the time to understand the doctor you actually became. Mom spoke up, her voice soft but clear. When you were little, you used to say you wanted to help everyone in the world who was sick. We thought it was just childhood idealism, something you'd grow out of when you learned how the world really worked. But you didn't grow out of it, Dad continued. You found a way to actually do it. You found a way to help everyone in the world who was sick, and we were too small-minded to see it. The admission hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of years of misunderstood intentions and missed connections. I should have explained my work better, I said. I should have helped you understand why it mattered to me. No, Mom said firmly. We should have asked. We should have tried to understand. We should have trusted that the son we raised to care about people hadn't suddenly stopped caring about people. Dad reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. This is from last year's Millbrook Herald, a little article about the town's new emergency preparedness protocols for disease outbreaks. The reporter mentioned that they were based on federal guidelines developed by the Surgeon General's office. He handed me the clipping, his expression sheepish. I read it 3 times before I realized those guidelines came from you, that you'd developed policies that were protecting our own community, and I'd never even thought to make the connection. You've been taking care of Millbrook all along, Mom added, taking care of all of us, in ways we never recognized. That evening, the 4 of us, Rachel, Derek, Mom and Dad, sat around Emma's hospital bed as she ate her first solid meal since arriving. She was chattering happily about the nurses, the hospital food, and her plans to tell all her friends about her adventure. Uncle John, she said between bites of applesauce, when I grow up, can I have a job like yours? What kind of job do you think I have, sweetheart? A job where you help all the kids in the whole country feel better. I looked around at my family, all of whom were watching this conversation with expressions of pride and understanding that had been absent for so many years. If that's what you want to do, Emma, I'll help you figure out how to make it happen. Will you teach me? I'd be honored to. As Emma drifted off to sleep that night, Surrounded by family members who finally understood both the scope of my work and the depth of my commitment to the people I served, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a decade. The sense that my professional identity and my family identity were finally aligned. The reckoning wasn't complete. Rebuilding relationships damaged by years of misunderstanding would take time and continued effort. But for the first time since leaving Millbrook for medical school, I felt like I belonged in both worlds, the world of national health policy and the world of Sunday dinners with people who loved me. The little girl sleeping peacefully in the hospital bed had unknowingly bridged a gap that had seemed unbridgeable, proving that sometimes the most important diagnoses aren't medical conditions, but the patterns of misunderstanding that keep families apart. 6 months after Emma's hospitalization, I found myself standing in the Millbrook Elementary School gymnasium, surrounded by every family in town, and feeling more nervous than I had during any congressional testimony. Rachel had organized what she called a health and safety night, but what I suspected was actually her way of formally introducing her brother's real work to the community that had watched me grow up. "Ladies and gentlemen," Principal Martinez announced from the makeshift podium, "please welcome Dr. Jonathan Pierce, our very own Surgeon General, who's here to talk with us about keeping our families healthy." The applause was warm but awkward. The sound of people clapping for someone they thought they knew, but were discovering they didn't know at all. Mrs. Henderson, who used to give me candy when Dad filled her prescriptions, stared at me like I'd grown a second head. Tom Bradley, who'd taught me to drive stick shift in the pharmacy parking lot, kept shaking his head in amazement. I'd spent the past months rebuilding relationships with my family, but this was different. This was about reclaiming my place in the community that had shaped me, while also sharing the expertise I'd gained in the wider world. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, looking out at faces I'd known since childhood. 6 months ago, many of you probably thought John Pierce had forgotten where he came from. I'm here tonight to tell you that everything I've learned about keeping people healthy started right here in Millbrook. I talked about childhood vaccination schedules, but I framed it through memories of getting my shots at Dr. Martinez's clinic. I explained emergency preparedness, but I connected it to the blizzard of '98, when the whole town pulled together to make sure elderly residents had heat and medication. I discussed nutrition programs, but I referenced the school lunch initiatives that Mom had championed during her years at the clinic. "The truth is," I continued, "public health isn't something that happens in Washington and gets imposed on communities. Public health is what happens when communities like Millbrook look out for each other, and my job is to help make that easier and more effective." After the presentation, people lingered to ask questions that ranged from genuine curiosity to barely concealed amazement. Several parents wanted advice about their children's health concerns. The new mayor, someone I'd gone to high school with, asked about federal funding opportunities for rural health programs. But the conversation that mattered most came from Dr. Morrison, the elderly physician who'd initially missed Emma's diagnosis. "John," he said, approaching me as the crowd thinned, "I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you some respect. I've been practicing medicine in this town for 40 years, and I've gotten comfortable with my limitations. What happened to Emma was a wake-up call. Dr. Morrison, you've served this community faithfully for decades. One misdiagnosis doesn't diminish that, but it could have cost a child her life. And it took the Surgeon General flying in from Washington to prevent that." He paused, looking around the gymnasium. "I've been thinking about retiring, but maybe what this town needs isn't for me to retire, but for me to learn new things. Would you be willing to help me set up some continuing education? Some way to stay current with pediatric emergency protocols?" The request was unexpected but perfect. "I'd be honored to help with that, Dr. Morrison. And maybe we could extend it beyond just you. Maybe we could create a rural medicine support network, connecting small-town physicians with specialists and updated protocols." That conversation sparked an idea that would reshape how I thought about my role as Surgeon General. Instead of just developing policies from Washington, what if I could create bridges between federal resources and rural communities? What if places like Millbrook could benefit directly from the expertise I'd gained in national health policy? 3 weeks later, I was back in my Washington office but with a new initiative taking shape. I'd assembled a team to develop the Rural Health Connection program, designed to link small-town physicians with urban specialists, provide real-time consultation for complex cases, and ensure that geographic isolation didn't mean inferior healthcare. Emma became our unofficial poster child for the program, though she was far too young to understand the significance. During our weekly video calls, a new tradition that had emerged from her hospitalization, she'd tell me about her friends at school, her soccer practices, and her plan to become a doctor who helps everyone like Uncle John. "Emma asked me something interesting yesterday," Rachel said during one of our conversations. She was calling from her kitchen in Millbrook while I sat in my office overlooking the Potomac River. "What did she ask?" "She wanted to know if you were sad that you had to live so far away from us." The question hit deeper than Rachel had probably intended. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that Uncle John's job is very important, and sometimes important jobs require sacrifices. But then she asked if we could visit you instead of always making you come to us." I was quiet for a moment, processing the simple wisdom of a 7-year-old solution to adult complications. "Rachel, would you and Derek consider bringing Emma to Washington? I could show you the CDC, maybe arrange for her to meet some of the pediatric specialists who consulted on her case." "She'd love that. We all would." The visit happened 6 weeks later, and watching Emma explore the corridors of power with wide-eyed fascination reminded me why I'd chosen this path in the first place. She asked questions that cut straight to the heart of complex policy issues. Why don't all kids get the same medicine when they're sick? Why can't doctors in small towns talk to doctors in big hospitals all the time? Her innocent curiosity inspired a presentation I gave to the cabinet about healthcare equity that one senior official later called the most compelling argument for rural health investment he'd ever heard. But the most meaningful moment of their visit came when Emma accompanied me to a pediatric policy meeting at the Department of Health and Human Services. I'd arranged for her to sit quietly in the back while we discussed childhood immunization strategies, thinking she'd be bored and we'd leave early. Instead, she listened intently as we debated how to reach children in remote communities who lacked access to regular health care. During a break, she tugged on my sleeve. "Uncle John, why don't the kids who live far away get sick preventing medicine?" "It's complicated, sweetheart. Sometimes the places they live are very far from doctors. But you could send the medicine to them, right? Like how Grandpa used to deliver medicine to people's houses when they couldn't come to the pharmacy." The simplicity of her observation sparked a discussion that led to a pilot program for mobile vaccination clinics in rural areas. Essentially a high-tech version of my father's old-fashioned house calls. As Emma's visit concluded, and my family prepared to return to Millbrook, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in how I understood my role. I wasn't just the family member who'd left home to pursue bigger things. I was the family member who'd gained tools and knowledge that could directly benefit the place I'd come from. The Rural Health Connection program launched 6 months later with Millbrook as one of the pilot communities. Dr. Morrison became one of our most enthusiastic participants, regularly consulting with pediatric specialists at Denver Children's Hospital and implementing updated emergency protocols that would prevent future cases like Emma's from being missed. On the first anniversary of Emma's hospitalization, I received a package from Millbrook Elementary School. Inside was a collection of thank you letters from students in Rachel's 3rd grade class, written as part of a unit on community helpers. One letter stood out from the rest. "Dear Dr. Uncle John, thank you for making sure kids don't get too sick. My teacher says you help kids all over America, but I think you help kids in Millbrook too because you helped me. When I grow up, I want to have a job like yours, where I can help everyone. Will you still teach me how? Love, Emma. P.S. Daddy says you're not just the Surgeon General, you're also the best brother and uncle in the world." I framed that letter and hung it in my office. Right next to my medical degree and my official appointment as Surgeon General, it served as a daily reminder that the most important diagnoses aren't always medical conditions, but the recognition of how personal connections and professional expertise can work together to heal not just individuals, but entire communities. The following year, the Rural Health Connection program expanded to 200 communities across 30 states. Emma started second grade with dreams of becoming a doctor. Derek began volunteer work with the local EMT service, inspired by what he'd learned about emergency medicine during our conversations. Rachel incorporated health education into her curriculum, teaching her students about nutrition, exercise, and disease prevention. And I continued to serve as Surgeon General, but with a deeper understanding of how national health policy could strengthen the communities that shaped the people we become. Sometimes, the greatest healing comes not from choosing between family and career, but from finding ways to honor both. Sometimes, the most important patient you'll ever treat is a 7-year-old niece whose illness teaches an entire family that love and expertise aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes coming home doesn't mean returning to the place you left, but bringing the best of what you've learned back to the people who matter most. In the end, Emma's hospitalization didn't just save her life, it saved our family's understanding of what it means to serve others, and taught us all that the distance between Washington and Millbrook is much smaller than we'd ever imagined, when measured in the things that truly matter. Protecting the people we love, and using our gifts to make the world a little bit healthier, one family, one community, one child at a time. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.